December 1st, 2018. It's just after midnight on a chilly Saturday in Baltimore, Maryland, also known as Charm City.
It's known as Charm City for a reason. There's culture, there's food, there's music. It's an amazing town.
But it's also a troubled one.
Baltimore's a dangerous city. There really is no denying that there's a problem with homicides, shootings, carjackings, armed robberies.
Baltimore has been on the top 10 list of violent crimes for a number of years, unfortunately.
And this bleak winter morning, it looks as if the city some call Bodymore Murderland is about to claim another victim.
Baltimore City 911.
I got a serious emergency.
The caller is 52-year-old Keith Smith.
Some panhandler just stabbed my wife.
He says they'd been driving down the street in East Baltimore when his wife, 54-year-old Jacqueline Smith, saw a woman with a baby begging on a street corner.
When Jacqueline spotted the baby, she asked him to pull over.
My wife tried to give us some money, and a guy came over, and he started stabbing my wife.
He's completely shocked.
They snatched her pocketbook and snatched her necklace off her neck.
And then they were gone.
I jumped out the car and he ran.
Okay, sir, you're still at the location right now, right?
I'm heading to the hospital.
He's hysterical, and he's trying to get his wife help.
I'm gonna go to Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is only a few blocks away, has one of the best trauma centers in the country.
While Keith's adult daughter tends to Jacqueline from the back seat, the dispatcher directs Keith to the emergency room.
You should better pull straight up and they'll be able to help you out.
But only if they're able to make it in time.
How's your wife doing?
She's not talking, man. She's not talking. She's not talking, man.
Oh my God. You stabbed her.
54-year-old Jacqueline Smith had always been a generous and compassionate woman.
She's a very giving person, a very kind person.
It's a Bible-believing Christian woman.
She was very involved in the church.
She was also an accomplished career woman.
Jacqueline Smith was a graduate of North Carolina A&T University, where she majored in engineering.
She's working as an electrical engineer, making good money.
She was just someone who a lot of people respected and wanted to be around.
Good morning, Jacqueline.
The only hitch in her life was the failure of her marriage, but she didn't let that stop her.
Okay.
Jacqueline is someone that has progressed in her career. She's been able to manage raising 2 children successfully, even getting past the trauma of divorce and successfully rise to the top.
Approaching 50 and with her children grown, Jacqueline decided to give love another chance.
She's at the point in her life where she's ready to start living again and possibly getting out there to find someone new.
And in 2013, it looked like she had found someone who fit the bill perfectly.
She meets this person at the VFW.
His name was Keith Smith.
Keith sees her and automatically, he's like, I've got to ask this woman out. I've got to get to know her.
Would you like to dance?
I love to.
Well, okay.
Keith was tall, dark, handsome. Jacqueline was knocked off her feet.
That first dance soon led to a first date, and then another.
They had a lot of different things in common.
They both had grown children who were entering adulthood themselves.
And like Jacqueline, Keith was eager to make a fresh start.
Later on in your years, you don't want to wait too long to start a new relationship. So shortly after, about 3 months later, he's proposing to her on Christmas Eve.
Oh, there's one more thing that I had.
Okay.
I know it hasn't been long, but just wondering if you would.
Sometimes a quick proposal can give you pause, but not for Jacqueline.
This is the win that she was looking for.
Keith moved into Jacqueline's townhouse in suburban Baltimore, and they began building a life together.
This is the moment that Jacqueline has been working hard towards. She is happy and content.
She's feeling like her prayers were answered, you could say.
But now Keith is driving through East Baltimore, desperate for help, as Jacqueline bleeds out in the seat beside him.
Oh my God. They freaking stabbed her.
His wife, being the kind-hearted woman she was, rolled down her window to give some panhandlers some money. And the panhandler reaches inside the car, robs her, and then starts stabbing her violently.
It happened so damn fast.
After the stabbing, the dispatcher guides Keith to Johns Hopkins University Hospital.
If you're making a right on the Wolf, the Hopkins is on your right when you get down there at, it should be Orleans.
Okay, I see it now. I see it.
But finding the hospital doesn't mean the crisis is over.
It is a big, big campus. It's not like a small country hospital. We are talking many blocks, many buildings.
Anyone, even in their right mind and calm, is going to have difficulty finding the exact entrance of the building.
I'm in the wrong side.
Keith is frantic.
Finally, after several agonizing minutes circling the sprawling medical complex, Keith manages to find the ER.
Please, I need help. My wife just got stabbed by some panhandler. She's in the car.
Then, as the ER staff rushed Jacqueline inside, Keith broke down completely.
Oh my God, baby. Hold on, baby. Hold on, baby.
54-year-old electrical engineer Jacqueline Smith had finally found happiness with her second husband, Keith.
She was looking for love second time around, and she was able to find that love.
It just looks like the perfect setup for both of these people that are in their 50s finally finding love and making this thing work.
But now, in the early morning hours of December 1st, 2018, Keith has just rushed Jacqueline to a Baltimore hospital.
Hold on, Jackie, hold on. Help! Help!
Help us!
Hold on, baby.
Come on, please hurry.
Please, please.
They pulled over so Jacqueline could give money to a panhandler. And when she rolled the window down, the man who was with a woman attacked Jacqueline.
Hey! Man.
Jackie!
Jackie, hold on, Jackie! Oh, God!
Nurses at the ER immediately rush her into emergency surgery.
What is going to happen to the love of his life?
By 1 a.m., he has the answer.
The nurse came back out to talk to Keith, and he could tell by the look on her face it was not good news.
We did everything we could for her.
No.
I'm so sorry.
No!
There was nothing they could do.
When Keith sits down with Baltimore homicide detectives several hours later, he's still trying to contain his grief.
He's playing it over and over in his mind, blaming himself, and the tears just stream down his face.
You're doing wrong, okay? I should have known. You can't blame yourself for this.
Once Keith regains his composure, he walks the investigators through what happened.
He and Jacqueline had gone to East Baltimore to celebrate his daughter Valeria's birthday.
They went to dinner at the VFW. They were enjoying themselves.
We had a beautiful time, man.
He says it was almost midnight when they left the VFW and headed east towards Valeria's home.
They were giving her a ride before they headed back to their home in Aberdeen.
According to Keith, while they were driving, his wife spots a panhandler.
We stopped at the stop sign. There's a girl over there.
She's holding a sign that says, "Can't feed my baby, need help."
She was holding the baby, and I was like, wow, how you gonna be out here with a baby this late at night?
He described a woman in her 20s, somebody who might have been addicted to drugs.
Not that it mattered to Jacqueline.
He said Jacqueline was so moved and troubled by this that she wanted to give her some money.
Look, pull over, pull over. Okay. Hey, sweetie, how are you?
She called the girl over.
Here, God bless you, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, the guy just walked over. Yeah, man, God dang your wife, man.
He described a man in his 30s who was wearing a heavy jacket with a goatee.
But according to Keith, when the man leaned in the window, it wasn't to say thank you.
The man grabbed her necklace, grabbed her wallet, and began stabbing her.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it.
He doesn't know what to do.
What did the knife look like? If you could tell, I know these things happen so quickly. That's okay. That's okay. So you just saw the motion?
He's not able to describe the murder weapon for the police.
When the stabbing occurred, what happened next? Did they just start running? They thought he snapped the necklace off and grabbed her pocketbook and ran.
That was about all the information the detectives were going to get from Keith.
He starts to break down in front of the officers again.
I should have pulled it off. I should have pulled it off. I should have never let her did that, man.
In those moments, you're thinking, you know, I'm the husband. I'm supposed to protect my wife, and I wasn't able to do that.
All right, we're gonna talk to your daughter real quick, then we can get you guys home, okay?
They're just trying to get as much information as they can, as quickly as they can, to aid their investigation.
When the detectives follow up with Keith's daughter, Valeria, her account corroborates her father's.
This girl came up to the car, she was asking for money, and I wasn't paying no mind. It wasn't until this guy came over that it caught my attention.
She was able to see everything that happened to her stepmother.
He came to the car, he was like, yeah, thank you, ma'am, and just started stabbing her. And like, it was literally like 2 seconds, and they were gone. She was just laying there, she's like, oh, it was just terrible.
However, in addition to confirming her father's story, Valeria also offers up a clue that may help find the killers.
She had seen which way the attackers ran.
She's pretty sure they ran off toward the basketball courts.
She thought they were headed to the Latrobe homes.
That's the project right there.
According to Jacqueline Smith's stepdaughter, the panhandlers who stabbed the 54-year-old electrical engineer fled in the direction of a Baltimore housing project.
One of the things about traumatic incidents, people can have different perceptions of what actually occurred. But in this particular scenario, you had a rather consistent story, so detectives felt like they had some pretty good leads.
However, before heading to the housing project, the detectives have Keith Smith's car towed to the crime lab.
They take the vehicle to search for DNA and other clues as to what exactly occurred that evening.
Then the detectives stop for a look at the street corner where the deadly encounter occurred.
Valley and Chase is in a community with mostly vacant homes. There aren't a lot of people there.
This isn't a typical area where people come to ask for money or food.
But is it the ideal place for an ambush?
Not only were there no witnesses around, the corner wasn't covered by any of the police surveillance cameras.
The detectives spend a few minutes combing the area for evidence.
They're looking for a murder weapon. They're looking for some signs that says there was a struggle.
They were also hoping to find Jacqueline's purse.
Oftentimes, criminals want to get rid of it, get what you can out of it as quickly as possible, then discard it.
Unable to find a discarded knife or purse, the detectives make their way to the Latrobe Homes housing project.
The almost 700-unit complex, built in the 1940s, is one of Baltimore's oldest public housing developments.
They canvassed the area, asking questions. They did not find anyone that matched the description that Valeria and Keith gave of the two people.
Reviewing the Housing Authority's security footage from the night of the stabbing also fails to turn up anyone fitting the suspect's description.
Maybe she got it wrong, and they weren't heading toward the projects.
Latrobe Homes an apparent dead end, the detectives try a different approach.
They put a trace on Jacqueline's credit cards.
While the detectives search for Jacqueline's killers, her murder becomes big news in Baltimore.
There's lots of media attention, a media frenzy. It's all over the news, and it's really beginning to cause concern for the community.
This is a crime where anyone could have been a victim. That's what was so scary to the community. Often, homicides will happen in the city because somebody is involved in illegal activity, but panhandling, that's something that any citizen could fall victim to by simply trying to help someone.
It really created a level of fear in the community that wasn't existent previously.
The fear only amplifies after the story goes from local tragedy to national headline.
Oprah Winfrey got hold of this story, and she retweeted it to her 40 million plus followers on Twitter.
She's given out money to panhandlers thousands of times. But now she's going to think twice about whether she rolls down that window. That's the impact that it had across the country.
You have people from all over viewing these people who need help as dangerous.
We have been socialized to have a fear of unhoused individuals. And this story played into those fears.
Much of the media's attention centers on Keith.
He's doing a lot of press. He's talking to the media about what happened, and he's trying to get action.
He believes that the panhandlers are the reason that he's lost the love of his life, and he wants something done about it.
This is a husband who wants to make sure no other family experiences what they've experienced.
He wanted there to be a law passed against panhandling in the city.
He wants to name it Jacqueline's Law.
As the debate about panhandlers rages, the Baltimore police may be on the verge of catching Jacqueline's killer.
Yes, ma'am. Can I help you?
A couple of days into this investigation, police received what they believe is a great lead.
The same day that Oprah tweets about the case, a woman approaches an officer sitting in his patrol car outside a Baltimore shopping center.
The woman comes forward saying that she had been calling the tip line but couldn't get through.
She's been trying to get through to let them know, hey, look, I've got a potential lead in this case.
The panhandler murder?
Yeah, that panhandler.
Okay.
I believe I know who did it, and it wasn't no panhandler.
She believed a gentleman by the name of Damon Booth could be responsible.
The woman tells the officer that Damon Booth has been committing armed robberies in the Latrobe Homes area.
Latrobe Homes, of course, was the housing project that the killers were heading toward after the murders.
And that's not the only thing to suggest the tipster may be right.
And does Damon live in Latrobe Homes?
No, he doesn't live there, but his girlfriend lives there.
Okay.
She lives in the housing project with her mom.
Is this the couple that set up Jacqueline and committed this murder?
Baltimore police have received what appears to be a credible tip that the so-called panhandler who stabbed Jacqueline Smith is actually a petty thief named Damon Booth.
Police further learned from this tipster that Damon Booth has a girlfriend, and the girlfriend happens to live in Latrobe Homes.
Latrobe Homes was the housing project that was a few blocks away from the East Baltimore Street corner where the murder occurred.
Putting two and two together, you have a woman who was posing on the corner with this baby and a guy who comes up from the shadows and commits this crime, and they both flee towards Latrobe Homes.
Everything about the couple fits what Jacqueline's husband, Keith, and the daughter told detectives about the murder.
This is sounding like we're getting very close to cracking this case.
Thanks, officer. Appreciate it. Thanks.
When detectives pull Damon's rap sheet, it looks like they're even closer.
They find out that he does have a criminal record and that he spent 5 years in prison for armed robbery.
Reviewing the details of his armed robbery conviction also raises a big red flag for detectives.
He, in fact, held a knife to someone's throat.
Once the knife comes up, now they're really looking into him.
They may have found the culprit.
When detectives bring Booth in for questioning, he denies any involvement in Jacqueline's murder.
He'd said, I wasn't even in the area. I don't know what you're talking about.
I never even heard of this woman.
Her murder's all over the news.
Man, I don't even watch TV.
Damon did admit that his girlfriend lived in Latrobe Homes, but he never went to her apartment.
Why's that?
Her mom. She don't like me.
Damon tells investigators that he's not welcome around his girlfriend Tanya's home.
According to Damon, that's why he was nowhere near the crime scene when the stabbing occurred.
We got a room in a motel out on Pulaski Highway.
Which motel?
I forgot the name. It's just past Holland Avenue.
If Damon was telling the truth, that was more than 2 miles from the crime scene.
You were there all night?
Yeah, I was.
Damon tells the investigators that Tanya went to get food around 10 o'clock, but that was it. Otherwise, they were in the motel for the remainder of that evening.
You're free to go.
When detectives bring Damon's girlfriend Tanya in for questioning, she confirms their alibi.
She says she only left out once that night to get something to eat.
I walked like a block down the road to get some food.
What time was that?
About 10.
They give a consistent story.
Detectives were not about to take their word for it, though.
Thank you.
After talking to Tanya, they follow up at the motel where they supposedly spent the night.
Detectives are able to look at surveillance video. They're able to check the guest registry.
The footage corroborates Damon and Tanya's story. It shows them checking in, and it does not show Damon checking out until the following morning.
There's no way they were going to be able to be over at Valley and Chase where this murder occurred.
They may fit the description, but they were nowhere near that crime scene.
Their hot tip turns out to be a dud, and the forensic results from Keith's car are equally disappointing.
When the investigators get the forensics back, there are no fingerprints belonging to anyone other than Keith, Valeria, and Jacqueline.
Now, that's not completely unusual because we're talking about someone who reached inside the car, snatched the necklace, snatched the purse, and stabbed her to death.
So, of course, there wouldn't be any fingerprints inside of the car.
But just when the investigation is running out of steam, things heat up.
The investigators get notified that someone made 3 charges on Jacqueline's credit cards.
They trace the use of the card to 3 juveniles.
Obviously, none of the kids fit the description of Jacqueline's killers.
So how do they end up with her credit cards?
They say they found her purse at a local bus stop.
Knowing nothing about the murder, they'd taken the credit card that was left inside the purse and gone on a spending spree.
After talking to the kids, the detectives head to the bus stop where they reported finding the purse.
It wasn't far from the scene of the crime.
Suspecting the killers passed by the bus stop as they fled the scene, the detectives pull footage from the various city surveillance cameras along the most likely routes.
They're looking at numerous surveillance videos, 27 different cameras.
You kind of can string together things. They might not necessarily point to a specific area, but there is no doubt within a couple blocks, you're going to run across a city watch camera.
As the detectives review the footage from the night of the murder, they once again hit a dead end.
There's no one in any of the footage that matches the description of the perpetrators described by Keith and his daughter Valeria.
However, as they review footage from closer to the crime scene, they notice something else.
None of the video footage reflects Keith's car being in the vicinity.
We're talking about 27 cameras, and the car doesn't show up anywhere.
It was not even along the route from the crime scene to the hospital.
None of the surveillance footage corroborates their story.
After scouring hours of video surveillance looking for the panhandlers who allegedly killed Jacqueline Smith and stole her purse, detectives have made a surprising discovery.
Not only was there no footage of the killers, there was no footage of her husband's car.
The entire route, investigators checked the cameras and were unable at any point to see Keith, Valeria, their vehicle, or either panhandler.
Had Keith and his daughter Valeria simply made a mistake about the route they took to the hospital?
Maybe they get one street mixed up with another.
Or was there another possibility?
Maybe they were lying about this whole thing.
Oh my God, he stabbed her.
Detectives figure there's one way to find out the truth.
Investigators obtained warrants for Keith and Valeria's cell phones, the GPS data, as well as Google data.
And the data suggests that Keith and his daughter have been lying to detectives.
Valeria's cell phone was pinging northwest in Druid Park.
The direct route to her apartment from DFW Hall, where they had dinner, didn't go anywhere near the park.
Investigators were able to determine that Keith and Valeria and Jacqueline were at Druid Hill Park for at least 12 to 16 minutes.
But what were they doing during that time?
Druid Hill Park isn't a place normally where an individual would pull over or stop at in the middle of the night.
It's a perfect place to commit a crime.
Hoping to learn why Keith might want to kill his wife, the detectives quietly reach out to the couple's relatives.
When they talked to Keith's brother, they found a possible motive.
He revealed to detectives that Jacqueline Smith was unhappy.
Jacqueline had been talking about divorce.
A divorce would be a serious hit to Keith's lifestyle.
Jacqueline was the primary breadwinner, and the house was in Jacqueline's name. So Keith had everything to lose if Jacqueline was to walk away from him.
But if she died, Keith had a lot to gain.
It turns out that Jacqueline has a life insurance policy that would pay out a significant amount to Keith.
The detectives found that Keith was already making inquiries about a payout.
After learning of the pending divorce and the possible insurance motive, the detectives make Keith and his daughter the sole focus of their investigation.
The detectives got a court order for a tap on both of their cell phones.
Then the detectives turn up the heat by bringing Keith in for another round of questioning.
They inquire about the life insurance and Keith's interest in the proceeds.
He talks about needing the insurance payment for burial costs.
Do they cover it, the funeral and all that? It's going to get covered.
He gets emotional.
I wouldn't wish this on anybody, man. She's my soulmate.
Detectives don't confront him and let him know that they know he's lying and that his story does not add up. Instead, they bring Valeria back in for another interview.
Questioned by detectives, she repeats the story of how her stepmother was stabbed by a panhandler.
I've never seen anything like that before. That was the worst day of my life.
She didn't know it yet, but she was about to have another bad day.
Detectives confront her with what they know.
What would you say if I tell you your phone had you in Drew Hill Park for a substantial amount of time?
I don't know. I must have been asleep.
The detectives aren't buying it.
I'm gonna be honest with you. We know that's bull.
Though Valeria must know that the detectives know more than what they've disclosed, Valeria doesn't break.
I don't appreciate being called a liar.
She stops the interview.
A lawyer. Okay, all right. 'Cause this is crazy.
Invoking her right to seek an attorney suggests that she knows that she could be in criminal trouble.
The question is, what is her next move?
Detectives were hoping that she'd panic and contact her father about the police interview.
Investigators are listening to their conversations on a wiretap.
Authorities discovered that Keith and Valeria had rented a vehicle.
And the detectives have a pretty good idea where they're headed.
Detectives alert Texas authorities to ensure that Keith and Valeria do not flee the U.S.
Keith and his daughter Valeria are arrested in Texas, very close to the Mexico border.
Hands up, look forward, turn around, turn around.
Now all the authorities have to do is prove Keith did kill Jacqueline. And they get one step closer when shortly after Keith and his daughter are extradited back to Maryland, Valeria's attorneys reach out to the prosecutors.
She wants to cut a deal.
This was potentially a huge break for the prosecutors.
Valeria's testimony could be the key to convicting her father of murder. So when the detectives and prosecutors sit down with her, they make it clear what they want.
What we're trying to do is figure out the truth of exactly what happened to Jacqueline Smith on the night of December 1st, 2018.
She agrees to not leave anything out and to tell the truth to the best of her recollection.
Although she claims her memory of that night is a little hazy.
I was doing drugs and I was drinking.
But she does remember one thing clearly.
My father stabbed her.
Jacqueline Smith's stepdaughter, Valeria, has just told police and prosecutors that it wasn't a knife-wielding panhandler who killed the 54-year-old engineer. Instead, she says it was her father, Keith Smith.
Rode to a park, and while we were in the park, my father stabbed her.
But she claims that she didn't have anything to do with the murder.
Valeria told police that she did not know what her father's plans were that evening.
According to Valeria, she thought they were just going out to celebrate her birthday.
Keith and Jacqueline had taken her to the VFW American Legion for her birthday.
She could tell something wasn't right between Jacqueline and her father.
It definitely felt like it was like some tension.
But did she suspect that there could be a murder committed that evening? Not at all.
After leaving the VFW, she says she barely noticed when her dad took a detour to Druid Hill Park.
She says she wasn't paying attention. She was on her phone.
The car slowed down, and that's when I noticed that we was, in like the woods or whatever.
According to Valeria, Jacqueline never even noticed that much.
She states that Jacqueline had dozed off.
And while Jacqueline was still asleep, that's when she saw her father pull out a knife.
I seen him reach and stab her.
Okay. And you're making a motion as
Like
His right hand.
Yeah, she was sitting right here, and he stabbed her like this.
Because she was asleep, Jacqueline didn't know what hit her. She gasped, and then it was over.
So you see how many times he stabbed her?
I don't remember how many times he stabbed her. I wasn't really even trying to, I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
She was stunned.
I just was just sitting there. I couldn't believe it.
Okay.
And I was just looking at him like he just looked like I didn't know who he was anymore.
What did you do, Dad? Get out of the car!
And when he told me to get out the car, I was scared.
She said she was afraid that her father was going to kill her next.
Instead, he gave her an ultimatum.
She says her father said to her, I'm going to make up a story, and you need to go along with it, or else we're both going to go to jail.
Calm down, calm down. We pulled up, we gave them money, and the panhandler did it. Look at me. You want me to go to jail? You want to go to jail?
She was panicked, in a bad state from the drugs. She agreed to go along with it.
Then, as they drove to the hospital, Keith called 911 and gave the operator the story he'd worked out.
I believe he's going to stab my wife. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Was he crying before he called 911?
No.
She says they got rid of the knife and threw it down a storm drain the night of the murder.
She also admitted she ditched Jacqueline's purse at the bus stop a few days after the murder.
He asked me to get rid of it, but to put it somewhere where someone would find it, because he wanted somebody to use their card so it would look like a real panhandler did it.
When Keith goes on trial in December of 2021, his daughter is the prosecution's star witness.
When his daughter came into the courtroom to testify, it was as if she didn't even really want to look at him.
Valeria's statements were very damning to Keith.
But was the prosecution's star witness also their greatest weakness?
The defense bring up the fact that she's a drug addict. She has a history of lying, and she's only doing this to get herself off.
They attacked her for not turning in her father before they actually got caught.
The defense also didn't put Keith on the stand to refute anything or to tell his version of the story.
Will smearing Keith's daughter be enough to secure her father's acquittal?
In the end, the jury found Keith guilty of murder.
The judge sentenced him to life in prison.
The family felt justice had been served.
You want to go to jail?
But Keith Smith wasn't alone that night.
Valeria pleads guilty to being an accessory after the fact and gets 5 years in prison.
The prosecution needed her testimony to put Keith away.
And there's no doubt it was Keith who killed the woman he'd promised to love.
Jacqueline Smith never thought it would be her husband who would take her life.
And he brought his own daughter in on it and destroyed his own family and destroyed another family as a result.
However, they weren't the only ones who suffered.
This man maligning people who were panhandling was incredibly harmful for Baltimore's homeless.
He stoked the lie that people who are homeless are a danger.
And that is something that Jacqueline would never have condoned.
Jacqueline was a loving person, an avid churchgoer, believed in God.
And, we'll never get a kind woman back who was known as a very compassionate person.
On a warm July night in Los Angeles, the city never truly sleeps, but it does shift into a different rhythm. The traffic thins on certain streets, neon signs buzz a little louder in the quiet, and the sidewalks around the university districts become almost strangely empty, as if the city itself is holding its breath between one moment and the next. Near the University of Southern California, that silence is not absolute, but it is different enough to feel noticeable. Students move in small clusters, some laughing after late dinners, others walking quickly with their heads down, keys already in hand before they reach their doors. It is the kind of night where nothing feels unusual, and yet everything is vulnerable simply because of how ordinary it all seems. In the early hours of July 24, 2014, that ordinary rhythm would fracture in a way that would later be remembered not for its chaos, but for its suddenness. There was no warning sign that anyone nearby would have recognized at the time. No scream that carried far enough to draw immediate attention. No dramatic build-up that would announce itself as something historic. Instead, what happened unfolded in fragments, scattered across a short stretch of street near campus, pieces of a moment that would only later be stitched together by investigators trying to understand how a routine night walk turned into a fatal encounter. At the center of this story was a young man named Shinran Ji, a graduate student at the University of Southern California. He was 24 years old, living far from home, building a future in a country that was both full of opportunity and unfamiliar risks. Like many international students, his life was defined by routine and discipline, long hours of study, late-night academic discussions, and the quiet repetition of walking familiar routes between campus and his residence. Those who knew him described him not in dramatic terms, but in steady ones. Focused. Serious. Someone who came to the United States with a clear purpose and carried it with him in every step. On that night, Ji had done what countless students do after an evening of study. He had been out late for a group session, likely discussing assignments or research with classmates, the kind of academic gathering that stretches time without anyone noticing until suddenly the night is much later than expected. When it ended, he left to return home on foot, moving through the familiar streets near USC. The distance was not unusual. The route was not considered extraordinary. It was, in every sense, a walk he had probably taken many times before. But the city at night is not just a backdrop. It is a shifting environment where visibility narrows and distance between people can become unpredictable. Streetlights cast uneven pools of illumination, leaving pockets of shadow between them. Passing cars briefly wash sidewalks in light before disappearing again. And in those transitions between light and darkness, awareness becomes both sharper and more fragile. It was in this environment that a group of individuals approached him. According to later accounts, there were 4 of them. They were young, moving together, acting not as strangers drifting through the night, but as a coordinated presence. Their intentions were not hidden for long. The encounter quickly shifted into something aggressive, something that did not belong to the ordinary flow of pedestrian movement. What began as proximity became confrontation, and what might have been a brief exchange escalated into violence. There is a particular kind of moment that victims of street attacks later describe, a narrowing of time where the brain struggles to accept what is happening. It is not just fear, but disbelief layered on top of it, as if reality has failed to follow its expected rules. For Ji, that moment would have come suddenly, without preparation, as the situation around him changed from simple movement through a street into something far more dangerous. The attack involved physical force and blunt objects, including a baseball bat. The use of such an object transforms violence into something heavier, more mechanical, less personal in appearance, but often more devastating in impact. Each strike carries not just intent but momentum, the kind of force that leaves little room for defense. In that short span of time, Ji was overwhelmed. The street, once familiar, became a place of disorientation and urgency. He was struck repeatedly. The blows were not symbolic. They were direct and forceful, targeting the upper body and head. In situations like this, the human body's instinct is to survive through movement, and G attempted exactly that. Even under severe injury, he tried to escape. That detail would later stand out in the investigation, the fact that despite what he had endured, he did not collapse immediately where he was attacked. Instead, he moved, driven by a mixture of instinct, pain, and the desperate hope of reaching safety. He ran through the night air, toward the direction of his residence, each step likely accompanied by disorientation and shock. The distance between the site of the attack and his destination became a kind of silent witness to his final effort. A path that should have been routine became a corridor of survival. There is something profoundly human in that image, not in its tragedy alone, but in its persistence. Even when the body is failing, the mind often continues to aim for safety. What happened next would only be understood in pieces. G eventually made it back to his apartment building. That fact alone carries a weight that is difficult to ignore. He had escaped the immediate scene of violence. He had reached a threshold of safety. But the injuries he sustained had already done irreversible damage. Somewhere between the street and his final steps indoors, the balance between survival and collapse shifted beyond recovery. Inside the building, the world would have been quiet again. Hallways lit with artificial light, doors closed, the distant hum of air conditioning systems. In such environments, violence feels almost impossible, as if it belongs to another world entirely. Yet it is precisely this contrast that makes the aftermath so haunting. The absence of noise does not mean the absence of suffering. It only means that the suffering is contained, hidden behind walls and doors until someone discovers it. It would not be until the following morning that the full reality of what had occurred began to surface. A roommate, unaware of what had taken place during the night, would make a discovery that immediately transformed confusion into alarm. The details of that moment would later become part of the official record, but at its core it was a moment of recognition that something had gone terribly wrong. The presence of a body where there should have been rest and routine signaled not just an emergency, but a loss that could not be reversed. By the time authorities were notified, the story had already crossed the invisible boundary between incident and investigation. What had begun as a nighttime encounter on a street near USC was now a case file, a scene to be reconstructed, a timeline to be rebuilt from fragmented evidence and witness accounts. Officers arriving at the location were faced with the task of understanding not only what happened, but how such a rapid escalation of violence could occur in an area so close to a major university. Early assessments indicated that this was not a targeted attack rooted in personal conflict. Instead, it appeared to be a crime driven by opportunity, an encounter that escalated into robbery and then into something far more severe. That distinction would become central to the investigation in the days that followed, shaping the direction of police work and public understanding. But at this initial stage, none of those conclusions were yet clear. What remained was the immediate shock of the event itself, the unsettling reality that a young student had been attacked and killed during what should have been a routine walk home. The streets around USC, so often filled with the predictable rhythm of student life, now carried a different kind of attention. Every corner, every shadow, every stretch of sidewalk became part of a larger question that had no immediate answer. How could something like this happen here, at this time, to someone whose only action was to return home? That question would follow the case from the very beginning, echoing through investigations, interviews, and later courtroom proceedings. But on that night, it existed only as silence, stretching across the city until on the surface, University Park, near the University of Southern California, in 2014 looked like a place carefully balanced between ambition and fragility. It was a neighborhood shaped by students who arrived from every corner of the world, bringing with them different languages, different expectations, and the shared assumption that education could serve as a shield against chaos. But beneath that assumption, the environment carried a tension that was less visible than architectural flaws or police reports. It was the tension of a city that expands faster than its sense of cohesion, where opportunity and vulnerability often occupy the same streets. Los Angeles has always been a city of layers. There are neighborhoods where wealth and security feel almost insulated, and others where distance from danger is measured in seconds rather than miles. USC sits in a transitional zone between those realities. It is a prestigious academic institution surrounded by blocks that do not always reflect the stability of its campus life. This contrast is not accidental, it is historical, shaped by decades of urban development, economic disparity, and shifting demographics. By 2014, that contrast had become part of the daily experience of students, something they were warned about during orientation, something they learned to navigate with a mixture of caution and adaptation. For international students like Shinran Ji, this environment carried an additional layer of complexity. Coming from another country, there is always an adjustment not just to academic systems, but to the unspoken rules of space and behavior. In his home country, the patterns of safety and danger might have been different, more predictable in certain ways, less fragmented in others. In Los Angeles, those patterns often depended on timing, awareness, and luck. Students quickly learned which streets felt safer at night, which shortcuts should be avoided, and how group movement often provided a sense of security that solitary travel did not. But knowledge does not always translate into protection. Even when students understand risk intellectually, the routines of academic life often override caution. Research deadlines stretch into late-night hours. Group meetings end unpredictably. Libraries remain open far beyond what the body naturally considers reasonable. And so, despite awareness, movement through the neighborhood continues, repeated day after day until it becomes habitual. In that habitual movement lies a subtle danger. Familiarity can soften vigilance. A route walked many times begins to feel less like a potential risk environment and more like a neutral corridor between two safe points. For Shinran Ji, as for many others, the path between campus and home was likely one of those familiar corridors. It was not perceived as an adventure or a challenge, but as a transition, something to be completed efficiently so that rest or continued study could follow. The social environment surrounding USC, in 2014, also included ongoing discussions about safety. There were alerts, advisories, and campus communications that reminded students to remain aware of their surroundings, especially during late hours. These messages were not unusual for urban universities in the United States, but they created a background awareness that hovered over student life like a quiet instruction. Most students absorbed these warnings without allowing them to dominate their daily decisions. They became part of the mental noise of urban living, acknowledged, but not always actively considered. At the same time, the broader city of Los Angeles was experiencing patterns of street crime that affected various neighborhoods unevenly. University-adjacent areas often became zones of opportunity for impulsive theft or group-based assaults, where mobility and anonymity could combine in dangerous ways. These were not crimes that followed elaborate planning in many cases, but rather moments of convergence between intent and vulnerability. A person walking alone, a group seeking quick gain, a brief window where paths intersected. Understanding this context is important not to explain away what happened, but to recognize the environment in which it occurred. Crime does not emerge in isolation, it forms within social and spatial conditions. Yet even with that understanding, there is always something unsettlingly individual about each incident. Statistics describe patterns, but they do not capture the exact moment when a human life is interrupted by violence. Inside the USC community, international students formed a significant and visible presence. They contributed to the academic and cultural fabric of the university, often forming close-knit communities for support. Many of them lived within walking distance of campus housing, relying on pedestrian movement as their primary mode of transportation. This created a rhythm of life that was both independent and exposed. Walking alone at night was not uncommon, but it always carried an unspoken calculation of risk versus convenience. The neighborhood itself was not static. It was undergoing gradual changes, with new housing developments and increased university security measures attempting to reshape perceptions of safety. Security patrols were present, and emergency call stations were installed in various locations. However, the effectiveness of such measures often depends on timing and proximity. A security presence cannot be everywhere at once, and incidents that unfold quickly can occur outside the reach of immediate intervention. On nights like July 23 into July 24, the city enters a transitional state where the boundary between structured activity and informal movement becomes more pronounced. Academic buildings are closed or nearly empty. Residential areas are quiet. Traffic is reduced. In this reduced noise environment, human interactions become more noticeable, but also more isolated. A small group walking together stands out. A single person walking alone becomes even more visually distinct. This visibility, however, does not necessarily translate into protection. In some cases, it can have the opposite effect. Isolation, even in a populated area, creates vulnerability because it removes witnesses and reduces the likelihood of immediate interruption. For individuals intent on opportunistic crime, such conditions can create perceived openings. It is within this layered environment that Shinranji's final journey that night took place. He was not an anomaly within the system, he was part of its expected flow. A student returning home after academic work, moving through a space designed for shared use, but experienced individually in moments of transit. The sidewalks he walked on were the same ones used by thousands of others, yet each person's experience of those sidewalks was fundamentally private. What makes this case linger in memory is not only the violence itself, but the way it intersects with normality. There was no extraordinary deviation in his actions that night. No decision that placed him in an obviously forbidden space. No known conflict that escalated over time. Instead, there was routine meeting unpredictability, and the outcome was irreversible. As dawn approached after that night, the neighborhood continued its usual transition into morning activity. Students woke up, prepared for classes, checked their phones, and began moving toward campus. Coffee shops opened their doors. Buses resumed their routes. From the outside, nothing immediately suggested that something irreversible had occurred just a few blocks away. This contrast between ongoing daily life and unseen tragedy is one of the most difficult aspects of urban violence to comprehend. The city does not pause, even when individuals within it have been permanently changed. It would take time before the reality of what happened fully entered public awareness. In the early stages, there is always a gap between incident and understanding. Authorities begin their work, but information travels slowly, filtered through investigation, verification, and procedural caution. Within the community, rumors may circulate, but clarity arrives only later, once facts are assembled into a coherent narrative. At USC, as the morning unfolded, most students remained unaware of the specifics. They would later learn that a fellow student had been attacked, that the incident had occurred nearby, and that the consequences were fatal. But at that initial moment, before official confirmation reached everyone, the neighborhood still functioned as if continuity had not been broken. This is often how tragedy first appears in a place like this, not as a sudden collapse of order, but as a delayed realization that order was interrupted somewhere out of sight. On campus, Shinranji was not just another name on a roster, or another face passing through lecture halls. To those who interacted with him regularly, he represented a familiar kind of presence found in many graduate programs. Quiet but consistent, reserved but deeply engaged. He was the kind of student who did not seek attention in crowded rooms, yet his absence would later create a silence that felt disproportionately large. His life at the University of Southern California was built around structure. Like many international graduate students in demanding technical fields, his days were likely divided into long stretches of focused study, occasional collaborative meetings, and brief moments of rest that rarely felt long enough. Electrical engineering at a graduate level is not simply a course of study. It is an environment of constant problem solving, where mental effort continues long after physical exhaustion begins. Within that rhythm, students often develop a narrow but intense world, one that revolves around laboratories, problem sets, and research discussions that stretch late into the night. Friends and classmates who knew him described him in ways that reflected reliability more than flamboyance. He was not the loudest voice in a discussion, but he was present, attentive, and engaged. In group settings, he contributed steadily, the kind of person whose input anchored conversations rather than dominated them. There are people who fill space with energy, and others who fill it with consistency. Shinran Ji belonged to the latter category, and in academic environments, that kind of presence is often quietly essential. Being an international student added another dimension to his life. It meant navigating not only academic expectations, but also cultural distance. Every assignment submitted, every lecture attended, every conversation with peers carried an unspoken process of adaptation. Language proficiency, while strong, still required constant adjustment in technical discussions where nuance matters. Even simple interactions, like asking questions in class, or coordinating group work required confidence built gradually over time. Outside academics, life was likely more subdued. Many graduate students in his position form small circles of familiarity rather than broad social networks. Shared meals, late-night study sessions, and occasional conversations about life back home become the foundation of connection. In these environments, friendships are often practical, as well as emotional, formed through proximity and shared pressure. While there is no public narrative detailing every aspect of his personal relationships, what is clear is that he existed within a community that recognized him as part of its fabric. His residence near campus reflected the typical living arrangement of many students who prefer proximity over comfort. Apartments in that area are often chosen not for luxury, but for convenience. The ability to walk to campus, to return quickly after late-night study sessions, and to remain embedded in academic life outweighs other considerations. These spaces become extensions of the university itself, blurring the line between private life and academic identity. In such environments, routine becomes deeply ingrained. Leaving campus after a group study session would not have been unusual for him. The timing of academic work often defies conventional schedules, especially when group coordination is involved. Discussions can extend unexpectedly, problems can take longer than planned, and the sense of shared responsibility often overrides personal fatigue. When the session ended that night, it would have been a natural decision to walk home, as he had likely done many times before. There is a psychological familiarity that develops with repeated routes. The brain begins to map not just physical space, but emotional safety onto those paths. Certain intersections feel predictable, certain stretches of sidewalk feel uneventful. Over time, this predictability creates a sense of comfort that can reduce active awareness without eliminating it entirely. It is not negligence, it is adaptation. Humans cannot maintain constant high alertness in environments they perceive as generally safe. Within the broader student community at USC, there was always awareness of urban risk, but it existed alongside a strong sense of belonging to an academic institution that provided structure and protection. Campus security, student advisories, and the visible presence of university systems created a perception of managed safety. Students learned to balance caution with normalcy, adjusting their behavior without allowing fear to dominate their routines. Shinran-ji's daily life existed within this balance. He was neither isolated nor overly exposed. He was part of a functioning system that millions of students navigate in urban universities around the world. His experience was not unusual, which is precisely what makes what happened later so difficult to process. There was nothing in his routine that placed him outside the expected patterns of student life. Those who interacted with him during his final hours would not have perceived anything unusual. In group academic settings, students often focus intensely on subject matter, sometimes becoming unaware of time passing. Conversations about technical problems, equations, or project requirements can extend far beyond initial expectations. When such sessions end, there is often a brief recalibration as students prepare to leave, gathering belongings, checking phones, and mentally transitioning back to personal space. It is in that transition that many urban students shift from collective safety to individual exposure. Walking in groups provides a sense of shared presence, but as individuals peel away toward their respective residences, that shared buffer dissolves. For Shinran-ji, that moment of transition marked the beginning of a journey that would end in a way no one around him could have anticipated. His return route would have been familiar. Familiarity in urban environments is a double-edged condition. It reduces cognitive load, but also reduces alertness. The same path that once required careful observation gradually becomes automatic. Streetlights, intersections, building outlines, all become markers in a mental map that no longer demands active interpretation. This is how routine operates. It simplifies complexity until only movement remains. What makes his story resonate so deeply within the university community is not only the tragedy of his death, but the recognition of how ordinary his life was before it. He was not engaged in risky behavior. He was not involved in conflict. He was not isolated from support systems. He was simply a student moving through a city at night, following the same patterns that define student life in countless urban campuses. In the days following the incident, those who had known him began to reconstruct their memories of him in fragments. A conversation after class. A moment of collaboration on a difficult assignment. A quiet presence in a study room. These fragments, once ordinary and unremarkable, became weighted with meaning after his absence was confirmed. This is one of the most difficult emotional processes in the aftermath of sudden loss, the re-evaluation of memory, where neutral moments become significant simply because they are no longer repeatable. Within the broader campus environment, his identity shifted from individual to symbol in ways that often happen after tragedies involving students. He became associated with discussions about safety, vulnerability, and the realities of urban life surrounding universities. Yet behind those discussions, there remained a personal reality that cannot be fully captured by institutional response or public narrative. He was a young man building a future far from home, balancing academic ambition with the quiet challenges of adaptation. He was part of a generation of students who move across borders with the expectation that education will serve as a bridge to opportunity. And on that night, he was simply walking home, continuing a routine that had likely felt safe enough to never question in detail. It is within that simplicity that the weight of the story begins to form. On the night of July 24, 2014, Los Angeles did what it always does after midnight. It kept moving forward as if nothing could interrupt its rhythm. Cars still passed through intersections near the University of Southern California, their headlights cutting across empty stretches of sidewalk. Distant sirens rose and fell somewhere far beyond the campus district, blending into the city's constant background noise. And in the University Park neighborhood, where student life and urban tension coexist in uneasy proximity, a single encounter was about to unfold in a way that would later be described only through fragments of evidence and reconstruction. Shinran-ji had been walking home, following a route that, to him, was likely as familiar as the interior of his own apartment. The human brain has a way of compressing repeated journeys into automatic sequences. Steps become less consciously chosen and more mechanically executed. Turn left at a familiar corner, cross a street without needing to evaluate traffic, beyond a brief glance, past the same buildings that no longer register as individual structures, but as landmarks in a mental map. On nights like this, awareness is often divided between the physical world and the internal world of thought, unfinished assignments, conversations just completed, plans for the next day. It was within this state of ordinary transition that the group appeared. At first, there was nothing in their presence that would necessarily signal danger to an outside observer at a distance. 4 young individuals moving together through a city street is not unusual in itself. Students, friends, late-night pedestrians, even people simply cutting through neighborhoods for convenience, all of these are normal parts of urban movement. But what distinguishes safety from danger in these moments is not appearance alone, it is intention, timing, and convergence. The encounter happened quickly enough that it left little room for interpretation. There is a threshold in violent encounters where interaction ceases to be social and becomes physical, where words, if they exist at all, are only transitional elements before force takes over. That threshold was crossed. The group's behavior shifted from movement alongside the environment to direct engagement with a single individual. What followed was not a prolonged confrontation in the cinematic sense, but a rapid escalation of aggression. The presence of a baseball bat, later confirmed through investigation, transformed the encounter into something far more severe than a simple physical altercation. A blunt instrument like that does not require precision, it requires momentum. Each swing carries weight not just in force, but in consequence, turning a brief moment into lasting damage within seconds. In situations like this, time behaves differently for the person being attacked. Survivors often describe it as fragmented, as if the mind stops recording continuous motion and instead captures isolated frames. The approach, the first impact, the shock of pain that does not yet fully register as injury, and the immediate instinct to escape. For Shinran Ji, those frames would have been compressed into an almost unbearable sequence of rapid physical and emotional overload. He was struck multiple times. The blows targeted areas of the body where vulnerability is absolute, the head, the upper torso. These are not just physical targets. They are regions where consciousness itself can be disrupted. Yet even under such conditions, the human survival instinct persists with remarkable persistence. The body attempts to move even when coordination is compromised. The mind searches for exit paths even when visibility is reduced by shock. At some point during the attack, the situation shifted from confrontation to pursuit. This transition is critical in understanding what happened next. The attackers did not remain stationary. Instead, the encounter expanded into movement through space, transforming a single location of violence into a trajectory. Shinran Ji, despite his injuries, began moving away from the immediate site. That decision was not strategic in the conscious sense, it was instinctive. The body seeks distance from threat even when rational planning is no longer fully accessible. The street became a corridor defined by urgency. Each step forward was an act of resistance against physical collapse. Pain would have been escalating, not as a single sensation, but as layered signals from multiple injuries. Balance becomes unreliable in such conditions. Vision can narrow. Hearing can distort. Yet the drive to reach safety overrides these degradations, pushing the body toward a destination that represents survival. Behind him, the attackers continued their movement. The dynamic of pursuit changes the psychological structure of violence. It is no longer a static event, but a sequence of decisions made in motion. The victim is no longer simply present in a fixed location, but becomes a moving target, and the environment itself becomes part of the unfolding incident, corners that conceal, distances that lengthen or shorten unpredictably, and the growing uncertainty of whether escape is truly possible. At some point, separation occurred. The immediate contact ended, but the consequences had already been set in motion. Shinran Ji continued toward his residence, a place that now represented not just home, but the only perceived boundary between himself and continued danger. The human mind often simplifies complex geography into binary categories under stress, unsafe space and safe space. Everything becomes oriented toward crossing that boundary. The apartment building, when he reached it, would have appeared as the final threshold. Familiar architecture, known entry points, the expectation of security beyond the exterior world. He made it inside. That fact alone is significant in the timeline of the event. It marks the end of external pursuit and the beginning of internal collapse. But survival in motion is not the same as survival in outcome. The injury sustained during the attack was severe enough that even after reaching shelter, the body could not recover from the damage already inflicted. Trauma of that magnitude does not pause at thresholds. It continues its internal progression regardless of location. What appears as safety externally does not immediately translate into physiological stability. Inside the building, the environment would have been quiet. Hallways lit with artificial light. Doors closed. The ordinary stillness of residential space at night. There is something profoundly disorienting about suffering occurring in such an environment, because it contradicts the expectation of what inside represents. We associate interior spaces with control, with protection, with separation from external threat. Yet violence does not always respect those boundaries. At some point during the night, or early morning, Shinran Ji collapsed. The exact moment becomes part of forensic reconstruction rather than lived experience, but its impact is absolute. The transition from movement to stillness is the final physical shift in a sequence that began on the street and ended inside a building that should have represented safety. It was not until the following morning that the full reality of the situation became visible to others. A roommate discovered the scene, initiating the chain of events that would bring authorities into contact with what had occurred. By that point, the temporal gap between incident and discovery had already widened the emotional distance between cause and consequence. What had been an active, unfolding event during the night had become a static reality by morning. When police arrived, they were not responding to a live situation, but to its aftermath. The investigation that followed would attempt to reconstruct the sequence of movement, impact, and pursuit using physical evidence, witness accounts, and environmental analysis. But at the center of all reconstruction remained a simple, irreversible fact. A young student had been attacked during a routine walk home, and that encounter had ended in his death. The street where it began returned to its ordinary state by daylight. People walked through it without knowing what had unfolded there hours earlier. This contrast between knowledge and ignorance is one of the most unsettling aspects of urban violence. The city does not retain visible memory of every tragedy that occurs within it. Instead, it absorbs events and continues forward, leaving understanding to emerge only through later discovery. In the case of Shinran Ji, the incident would soon move from private tragedy to public awareness, but at this stage, within the early hours of investigation, it remained a fragmented story. A path walked, an encounter, a pursuit, a collapse. The full narrative had not yet been assembled, but the irreversible outcome was already established. On the morning of July 24, 2014, the area around the University of Southern California slowly transitioned from the stillness of night into the structured noise of daytime life. Students began to emerge from dormitories and apartment buildings, moving toward campus in familiar patterns shaped by lectures, schedules, and deadlines. Coffee shops filled with low conversations. Buses stopped and started at predictable intervals. Nothing about the neighborhood initially suggested that, only a few hours earlier, a violent encounter had unfolded just a few blocks away. The discovery of Shinran Ji's condition did not begin with a dramatic revelation, but with something far more ordinary and therefore more disorienting: a roommate noticing that something was wrong. In shared living spaces, small irregularities often stand out before anything else. A door left slightly ajar, an unexpected absence in a usual routine, or a silence that feels different from normal rest. It is often through these subtle deviations that tragedy first becomes visible. When his roommate entered the room, the expectation would have been routine, perhaps that Ji was asleep after a long night of studying, or resting before the day began. But instead, what was found disrupted that assumption entirely. The presence of serious injury in a space meant for safety created an immediate rupture between expectation and reality. In that moment, the apartment ceased to be just a home and became the endpoint of an event that had begun elsewhere. Emergency services were contacted quickly. In situations like this, time becomes a critical and cruel factor, because every minute carries the weight of irreversible internal damage already done hours earlier. First responders arriving at the scene are trained to assess not only visible conditions, but also the likelihood of survival based on trauma patterns and elapsed time. In this case, the severity of the injuries indicated a critical situation that had already progressed far beyond the point of easy intervention. As paramedics worked, the environment around them remained deceptively calm. Hallways where nothing had happened before that morning continued to look the same as they always had. Doors remained closed. Neighbors went about their routines unaware that a life had already been lost within the building's quiet structure. This contrast between emergency response and surrounding normalcy is one of the most unsettling aspects of urban incidents. The world outside the immediate scene continues, as if nothing has changed. By the time law enforcement began their involvement, the case had already shifted from an immediate rescue scenario to a forensic investigation. The focus moved outward from the apartment to the street where the initial attack had occurred. Officers began reconstructing the timeline backward, starting from the known endpoint and attempting to trace the sequence of events that led there. This process is methodical, built on fragments, surveillance footage, physical evidence, witness recollections, and environmental markers. The area surrounding USC is heavily traveled, even during late hours. This fact becomes important in investigations because it increases the likelihood that someone, somewhere, may have seen something relevant without realizing its significance at the time. In many urban cases, witnesses do not initially understand that what they observed is connected to a serious crime. A group moving quickly down a street, a brief altercation, or unusual behavior can all be dismissed in real time as insignificant. It is only later, when authorities piece together the sequence, that those moments gain meaning. Investigators worked to identify the exact location where the confrontation began. Based on early findings, the attack had occurred in a transitional zone between more active campus-adjacent streets and quieter residential blocks. This type of location is particularly significant in urban crime analysis because it offers both visibility and escape routes. It is neither fully isolated nor fully protected. It sits in between, which can create unpredictable risk conditions. The reconstruction of the event relied heavily on physical evidence. Marks on the ground, scattered personal belongings, and patterns of disturbance helped establish movement. In cases involving blunt force trauma, investigators also look for subtle indicators, such as direction of travel, points of impact, and areas where struggle may have shifted from one position to another. These details, while technical in nature, form the backbone of understanding what occurred in the absence of continuous eyewitness footage. As the investigation expanded, attention turned to possible surveillance systems in the area. Urban environments like Los Angeles often provide fragmented video coverage from private buildings, street cameras, or commercial establishments. Each camera captures only a narrow slice of reality, but when combined, these fragments can form a partial reconstruction of movement through space. Detectives began identifying which systems might have recorded relevant time windows. At the same time, the personal identity of the victim became central to the investigation's public dimension. Once authorities confirmed that Shinran Ji was a graduate student at USC, the case immediately gained attention within the campus community. University officials began coordinating with law enforcement while also preparing internal communications for students and faculty. These communications serve not only to inform, but also to manage collective anxiety, because incidents of this nature can rapidly affect perceptions of safety across an entire institution. Within hours, students began learning fragments of what had occurred. At first, details were limited and often imprecise. A student had been attacked nearby. The situation was serious. Authorities were investigating. As more information emerged, the reality became clearer and more difficult to process. The idea that someone from within their own academic environment had been killed during a routine walk home created a shared sense of shock that spread through conversations, social spaces, and online discussions. In parallel with public awareness, investigators began focusing on identifying potential suspects. Given the nature of the attack, early classification suggested a robbery-related motive that escalated into lethal violence. This distinction is important because it shifts investigative priorities toward opportunistic groups operating in the area rather than targeted personal conflicts. In such cases, the randomness of victim selection becomes one of the most troubling aspects, because it implies vulnerability that is not tied to individual behavior. Evidence collected from the scene and surrounding area eventually pointed toward a group of individuals operating together. The structure of group-based street violence often involves defined roles, even if informal. Some individuals engage directly, others observe or control surroundings, and some participate in pursuit or containment. Understanding these dynamics helps investigators reconstruct not just what happened, but how responsibility is distributed among participants. As the hours turned into days, the case moved from immediate emergency response into sustained criminal investigation. Detectives interviewed witnesses, reviewed footage, and cross-referenced data points to narrow down possible suspects. Each piece of information added incremental clarity, but also revealed the complexity of the sequence. Urban violence rarely unfolds in a single clean motion. It is layered, fragmented, and often chaotic in its execution. For those closest to Shinran Ji, the early phase of investigation was defined by uncertainty mixed with growing confirmation. Hope and dread coexist in such moments, as families and friends wait for official information that gradually narrows the gap between possibility and reality. When confirmation finally arrives, it does not do so gradually. It arrives as a single irreversible fact that redefines every prior moment leading up to it. By the end of this phase, the narrative of what happened had begun to take shape. A student walking home after a late academic session, an encounter on the street, a rapid escalation into violence, a pursuit toward safety, and a final collapse inside what should have been a secure environment. But even at this stage, the emotional weight of the case had not yet fully settled into public consciousness. That would come later as identities, motives, and legal proceedings began to unfold in the chapters that followed. In the early phase of the investigation into Shinran Ji's killing, the Los Angeles Police Department faced a kind of complexity that is common in urban street violence cases, but no less difficult to untangle each time it appears. The initial information was fragmented, arriving in pieces that did not yet form a complete picture. There was a confirmed victim, a known location of attack, a general time frame during late night hours, and clear evidence of severe blunt force trauma. But what was still missing was the structure behind it all. Who was involved, how the encounter began, and what sequence of decisions turned a brief street interaction into a fatal outcome. Detectives began by treating the case as a robbery-related homicide, a classification that immediately shapes the direction of investigative priorities. In such cases, the assumption is not that the victim was specifically targeted for personal reasons, but rather that the opportunity presented itself in an uncontrolled environment. This distinction matters because it shifts the focus from examining personal relationships to reconstructing movement patterns, group activity in the area, and possible repeat offenders operating nearby. One of the first challenges was identifying reliable witnesses. University-adjacent neighborhoods are densely populated with transient movement, especially during evening and night hours. People pass through quickly, often distracted by phones, conversations, or simply the fatigue of the day. As a result, even when individuals are physically present near an incident, their ability to recall details accurately is often limited. Investigators had to sift through accounts that were sincere but inconsistent, each one capturing only a partial slice of what had occurred. Some witnesses reported seeing a small group of young individuals moving through the area around the time of the attack. Others recalled hearing commotion, but could not clearly distinguish words or actions. A few remembered seeing a lone figure later moving in visible distress, though at the time they did not interpret it as part of an ongoing violent event. This is a common difficulty in urban investigations. Perception without context does not immediately translate into understanding. The physical evidence, however, began to provide more stable grounding. The location of the initial confrontation showed signs of sudden disturbance rather than prolonged struggle. This suggested a rapid escalation rather than a drawn-out conflict. Investigators examined the surrounding sidewalks, lighting conditions, and escape routes, mapping how individuals could have entered and exited the area within a short time frame. The geography of the neighborhood became a silent witness, offering clues through structure and limitation. Attention then turned to surveillance infrastructure. In modern urban environments like Los Angeles, video coverage is rarely complete, but it is often sufficient to reconstruct partial movement patterns. Cameras from nearby buildings, parking structures, and street-facing businesses were reviewed frame by frame. Each recording captured different angles and moments, and while no single source provided a full narrative, overlapping fragments began to suggest coordinated movement involving multiple individuals. From these fragments, investigators began to identify a group dynamic. Rather than a single perpetrator acting alone, the evidence pointed toward multiple participants with distinct roles during the incident. This type of structure is not uncommon in opportunistic street crime. Within groups, behavior often distributes itself naturally. One individual initiates contact, others provide presence or intimidation, and others monitor surroundings or assist in escape. These roles are not formally assigned, but emerge through collective behavior and shared intent. As the investigation deepened, detectives worked to match visual evidence with known individuals in the area. This process involved cross-referencing prior incidents, reviewing juvenile and adult records, and analyzing patterns of association among individuals previously observed in similar contexts. It is a slow and methodical process, requiring patience and careful validation at each step, because misidentification at early stages can derail entire investigative paths. Parallel to this analytical work, forensic examination of the victim's injuries provided additional insight into the nature of the attack. The pattern and distribution of trauma confirmed the use of a blunt object, consistent with a baseball bat, and indicated multiple impacts delivered in quick succession. This suggested a level of sustained aggression beyond a single impulsive strike. In forensic terms, the severity and repetition of force can help establish intent and participation levels among multiple attackers. The medical findings also reinforced the conclusion that despite surviving the initial confrontation and reaching his residence, the injuries had caused irreversible internal damage. This detail became important in reconstructing the timeline, as it explained the delayed fatal outcome and confirmed that the collapse occurred after a period of continued physiological deterioration rather than immediate death at the scene. As investigators connected these elements, they began to narrow down a list of potential suspects. Early leads focused on groups known to operate in the broader vicinity, particularly individuals previously associated with street-level theft or coordinated assaults. However, establishing a legal case requires more than association. It demands evidence of presence, action, and participation during the specific timeframe of the crime. One of the turning points in the investigation came when surveillance footage and witness accounts began to converge on a consistent set of individuals. While each source alone was incomplete, together they created overlapping confirmation. Movement patterns matched reported sightings. Timing aligned with emergency calls. And behavioral descriptions corresponded with captured visual data. This convergence allowed detectives to move from broad suspicion toward targeted identification. As names began to emerge, the investigation expanded into background analysis. This included reviewing prior contacts with law enforcement, mapping social connections between suspects, and identifying patterns of group activity. In cases involving multiple young offenders, understanding interpersonal dynamics is often as important as understanding the crime itself. Group behavior can be influenced by hierarchy, peer pressure, and situational escalation, all of which contribute to how responsibility is distributed during an incident. During this phase, investigators also worked closely with prosecutors to ensure that evidence was being collected in a way that would withstand judicial scrutiny. Every piece of information had to be documented, verified, and linked directly to the timeline of events. This meticulous approach is necessary because cases involving multiple defendants are often challenged on the grounds of individual responsibility, particularly when actions occur in rapid succession. As the investigation moved forward, arrests were eventually made involving multiple individuals connected to the incident. The charges reflected the severity of the crime, including robbery and homicide-related offenses. The transition from investigation to arrest marked a critical shift in the case, moving it from reconstruction of unknown events to formal legal accountability. For the community around USC, this phase brought partial clarity, but not emotional resolution. Knowing who was involved does not immediately resolve the deeper questions raised by the case: how such violence could erupt in a familiar neighborhood, how quickly routine movement can become dangerous, and how thin the boundary can be between safety and vulnerability in urban environments. Within the investigative team, however, there was a different kind of focus. The priority was no longer discovering what happened, but building a legally coherent narrative that could be presented in court. Every detail now had to serve a purpose within that framework, establishing presence, demonstrating participation, and proving intent beyond reasonable doubt. By the end of this phase, the case had moved from uncertainty into structure. The outlines of responsibility were becoming clearer, even if the full emotional weight of what occurred continued to resonate far beyond the investigative files. On the morning after the first arrests began to take shape in the Shinran G case, the investigation entered a new phase that fundamentally changed its direction. What had previously been a fragmented reconstruction of a street-level attack now began to solidify into a structured narrative of multiple actors, coordinated movement, and legal accountability. This shift did not happen suddenly in a dramatic moment of revelation, but gradually, through the accumulation of evidence that began to point in a consistent direction, narrowing uncertainty into something prosecutors could eventually present in court. Detectives had already established that the attack was not the result of a personal dispute. There was no evidence that Shinran G had any prior connection to the individuals involved. Instead, the pattern suggested opportunistic violence, a chance encounter that escalated into robbery and then into lethal force. This classification mattered because it defined not only how the crime was understood, but how responsibility would be distributed among those involved. In cases like this, the law must distinguish between those who initiate violence, those who assist, and those whose presence contributes to the outcome without direct physical action. As investigators reviewed surveillance footage in greater detail, the movements of the group began to take on clearer shape. What initially appeared as unrelated fragments from different cameras slowly aligned into a coherent sequence. The group was seen moving together through the area before the incident, their pace and positioning suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. In urban crime analysis, this distinction is critical, because coordinated movement implies shared intent, even if that intent is not explicitly verbalized. At the moment of the encounter, the footage captured a rapid convergence. Shinran-ji appeared alone, walking along a familiar route, while the group approached from a different direction. The interaction that followed was brief in recorded time, but significant in consequence. Within seconds, the situation escalated from proximity to confrontation. The visual record did not capture every detail of the physical attack, but it provided enough context to confirm that multiple individuals were present and actively involved in the unfolding event. One of the key breakthroughs in the investigation came when analysts began matching movement patterns across different camera angles. A single individual might appear in one frame, then reappear later in another location, allowing detectives to trace a path of travel through the neighborhood. When multiple individuals exhibit synchronized movement across these frames, it becomes possible to reconstruct group behavior even when continuous footage is not available. This method of reconstruction relies heavily on timing, spatial alignment, and consistency of appearance. As these patterns were verified, the identities of several suspects began to emerge more clearly. Some had prior contacts with law enforcement, while others were identified through association and presence in the same recorded group movements. The process of identification was not immediate or simple. It required cross-referencing multiple databases, confirming visual matches, and eliminating alternative explanations. Each potential identification had to withstand scrutiny, because premature conclusions could compromise the integrity of the entire case. During this phase, investigators also conducted extensive interviews with individuals in the surrounding community. While many witnesses could not provide detailed descriptions, their fragmented observations still contributed valuable context. Some recalled seeing a group behaving in a way that stood out from normal pedestrian movement, while others remembered hearing sudden commotion followed by rapid dispersal. These accounts, when placed alongside physical and digital evidence, helped reinforce the timeline constructed by detectives. As the case progressed, the legal framework of the investigation became increasingly important. Prosecutors began working closely with detectives to ensure that evidence collection aligned with the requirements for charging multiple individuals under homicide-related offenses. In cases involving group participation, establishing individual responsibility is often more complex than identifying who physically delivered harm. The law must consider presence, encouragement, facilitation, and direct action as separate but interconnected forms of involvement. This legal complexity became especially relevant as the investigation moved toward formal arrests. Authorities had identified multiple suspects, including both adults and younger individuals, each with different levels of involvement during the incident. The decision to charge them collectively under serious offenses reflected the conclusion that the crime was not the act of a single person, but a coordinated group action that resulted in fatal consequences. The arrests themselves marked a significant turning point. Overnight, individuals who had previously existed as uncertain figures in surveillance footage and witness accounts became formally named defendants in a criminal case. This transition from anonymity to legal identity is one of the most consequential shifts in any investigation, because it transforms abstract suspicion into structured accountability. From that moment forward, every action taken by law enforcement and prosecutors would be subject to judicial review. Inside the community around USC, news of the arrests spread quickly. For students and faculty, the case was no longer an abstract report of violence nearby. It had become a concrete narrative involving identifiable individuals and a confirmed sequence of events. This shift often changes how communities process trauma. Uncertainty gives way to clarity, but clarity does not necessarily bring comfort. Instead, it often deepens the emotional weight of what has occurred. For those involved in the investigation, however, the focus remained technical and procedural. The priority was to ensure that each piece of evidence was properly documented, each witness statement verified, and each suspect's role clearly defined within the timeline. This meticulous process is essential in multi-defendant cases, where defense arguments often attempt to separate individual responsibility from collective action. As more evidence was analyzed, the structure of the group's involvement became clearer. One individual appeared to take a leading role in initiating the confrontation, while others were positioned in supporting roles, either participating directly in the physical attack or contributing to the surrounding control of the situation. This division of roles, even if informal, is significant in legal terms because it supports the concept of shared intent. At the same time, forensic analysis of the injuries sustained by Shinran Ji reinforced the severity and coordinated nature of the assault. The pattern of trauma indicated repeated impacts delivered in a short time frame, consistent with multiple attackers acting in close proximity. This finding aligned with the surveillance interpretation and strengthened the overall case structure being developed by prosecutors. By the end of this investigative phase, the case had reached a point where the narrative was no longer speculative. The sequence of events, the individuals involved, and the general structure of responsibility had been established with sufficient clarity to proceed into the courtroom. What remained unresolved were the legal arguments, the defense strategies, and the final determination of sentencing. But at this stage, the transformation was already complete. What had begun as a late-night walk home had become a fully constructed criminal case, built from fragments of movement, observation, and evidence, now ready to enter the formal process of justice. By the time the Shinran Ji case reached the courtroom, the emotional weight of the investigation had already settled into something more structured, almost clinical in its presentation. What had once been a chaotic night on the streets near USC had been transformed into a sequence of reconstructed events, supported by surveillance footage, forensic analysis, witness testimony, and the coordinated work of detectives and prosecutors. In court, however, those fragments were no longer just pieces of an investigation. They became arguments, counter-arguments, and interpretations of responsibility that would determine the legal outcome for multiple defendants. The courtroom itself carried a different kind of tension compared to the streets where the crime had occurred. It was controlled, enclosed, and governed by procedure. Every movement was observed, every statement recorded, every pause between words measured against legal consequence. For the family of Shinran Ji, entering this space meant confronting not only the reality of what had happened, but the formal language through which that reality would now be defined. The prosecution began by laying out the foundation of the case with careful precision. They did not focus on emotion, but on sequence. A student walking home late at night. A group moving through the same area. A sudden confrontation. A rapid escalation into violence. And finally, a pursuit that ended only when the victim reached his residence, already critically injured. Each stage was presented as part of a continuous chain, where one action led directly into the next without interruption. Surveillance footage played a central role in the courtroom presentation. Though not always visually complete, it provided a framework that anchored the narrative in time and space. The jury was shown how multiple camera angles, when aligned, revealed coordinated movement by the group prior to the attack. They saw how the defendants appeared together before the incident and dispersed afterward. Even when individual actions, during the most violent moments, were partially obscured, the overall pattern of collective presence was difficult to dispute. The prosecution emphasized the concept of shared responsibility. In cases involving group violence, the law does not require that every participant deliver the same level of physical harm. Instead, it focuses on whether individuals acted in concert, whether their presence supported the commission of the crime, and whether their actions contributed to the outcome. This legal principle became central to how the case was argued. Each defendant was positioned not as an isolated actor, but as part of a unified chain of conduct that resulted in fatal consequences. Forensic testimony reinforced this structure. Medical experts described the nature of the injuries sustained by Shinran Ji in clinical detail, explaining the severity of blunt force trauma and the likelihood of rapid physiological decline following such impacts. They described how the pattern of injuries was consistent with multiple strikes delivered in quick succession, supporting the conclusion that more than one individual participated in the physical assault. In the courtroom, these descriptions were not abstract. They were grounded in evidence that connected directly to the timeline established by investigators. The defense, however, attempted to separate individual responsibility from collective presence. Their arguments focused on distinguishing between those who actively engaged in violence and those who were present, but not directly involved in physical contact. In multi-defendant cases, this distinction becomes the central battleground. Presence alone does not always equal guilt for the most severe charges, and the defense sought to exploit any ambiguity in the reconstruction of events. Some defendants were portrayed as peripheral figures, individuals who may have been present, but did not initiate, or directly participate in the most violent actions. Others were described as reacting to events rather than controlling them. The defense strategy relied heavily on fragmentation, breaking the unified narrative constructed by the prosecution into separate, less cohesive individual stories. Yet the prosecution countered this by returning repeatedly to the concept of convergence. The defendants did not arrive separately by coincidence. They moved together, approached together, and left together. In the prosecution's framing, this continuity of movement was not incidental, it was evidence of shared intent. Even if individual actions during the attack varied in intensity, the collective decision to engage in confrontation was what bound them together legally. As testimony unfolded, the courtroom became a space where two interpretations of the same sequence of events coexisted in tension. One view presented a coordinated act of group violence with shared responsibility. The other attempted to isolate actions and distribute accountability unevenly. The jury was tasked with navigating this divide, translating fragmented evidence into a single legal conclusion. For Shinran Ji's family, who sat through much of the proceedings, the courtroom experience was not about abstraction. Every reference to time, location, and injury corresponded to a person they had known. Yet the language of law often requires emotional distance in order to function. The narrative of a life was reduced to evidentiary points, not because the person was less significant, but because the legal system operates through structure rather than memory. Witnesses who testified during the trial added another layer to the reconstruction. Some described hearing commotion near the time of the incident. Others recalled seeing groups moving quickly through the area. While none of these accounts captured the entire event, they contributed to a broader mosaic of understanding. In court, even partial observations can become meaningful when combined with other forms of evidence. One of the most significant aspects of the trial was the confirmation of the pursuit that followed the initial confrontation. The prosecution presented this as a key element in establishing the severity of intent and the continuity of the attack. The fact that Shinran Ji was followed after the initial assault demonstrated that the violence did not end with the first encounter. Instead, it extended into a continued sequence that only concluded when he reached his residence. This detail carried particular weight in the courtroom, because it reinforced the idea that the event was not a spontaneous, isolated moment of conflict, but a sustained chain of actions. The legal interpretation of such continuity plays a crucial role in determining the level of charges and potential sentencing outcomes. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom atmosphere shifted again. The presentation of evidence had been completed, and now the focus turned to interpretation. The prosecution urged the jury to see the case as a unified act of violence with multiple participants sharing responsibility for a single outcome. The defense urged caution, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing individual actions and avoiding overgeneralization of guilt. When the jury finally began deliberation, the courtroom entered a period of waiting that felt both structured and uncertain. The evidence had been presented, the arguments made, and the narratives constructed. What remained was the process of internal evaluation that cannot be observed directly, but determines the final outcome. When the verdict was eventually delivered, it reflected the seriousness of the charges and the court's acceptance of group-based responsibility in the attack. Multiple defendants were found guilty on varying levels of charges related to homicide and robbery, with sentencing outcomes reflecting their assessed level of involvement. Some received life sentences without the possibility of parole, while others were given lengthy prison terms based on their role in the incident. The sentencing phase marked the legal conclusion of the case, but not its emotional end. In the courtroom, judgment had been rendered, but for those affected by the loss of Shinran Ji, the reality of what happened remained unchanged. The legal system had provided structure, accountability, and closure in a formal sense, yet the absence at the center of the case could not be reversed or resolved through procedure alone. As the proceedings concluded and the courtroom emptied, the case transitioned from active litigation into recorded history, preserved in legal documents, evidence archives, and public memory. What remained was the enduring tension between what can be proven in court and what is experienced in human loss, a divide that no verdict can fully close. In the months and years following the legal conclusion of the Shinran Ji case, the energy surrounding the incident did not simply disappear. It changed form. What had once been an active investigation, then a courtroom proceeding, gradually became something quieter, but more enduring, a memory embedded within institutional systems, personal lives, and the collective awareness of a university community that had been forced to confront violence in a place it assumed was defined by safety and aspiration. For USC, the aftermath was not just emotional but operational. Universities exist in a constant tension between openness and protection. They are built to encourage movement, late-night study, independent living, and intellectual risk-taking. But incidents like this force institutions to reassess the invisible boundaries that structure daily life. In the weeks and months after the case, conversations about campus safety became more frequent, more urgent, and more detailed. Not in abstract terms, but in practical ones: lighting on pedestrian routes, timing of security patrols, emergency communication systems, and the accessibility of safe transportation during late hours. Yet even as policies were discussed and adjusted, there was a recognition among students and staff that no system could fully eliminate vulnerability. Urban universities do not exist in isolation. They are embedded within cities, and cities carry their own dynamics, some of which cannot be controlled through institutional design alone. This realization created a kind of quiet dual awareness among students, a continued engagement with academic life, paired with a more conscious understanding of physical environment. For students who were present at USC during that period, the memory of the case did not remain confined to official announcements. It became part of informal conversation, often resurfacing at unexpected moments. A late-night walk back from the library. A group discussion that ran longer than planned. A reminder about safety messages sent by the university. These small moments would sometimes trigger recollection, not in a dramatic way, but in the form of brief internal acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened nearby, to someone who had been doing exactly what they themselves were doing. Shinran Ji's name gradually shifted in public discourse from immediate news to remembered case. But for those closest to him, that shift in terminology did not correspond to emotional distance. Grief does not follow institutional timelines. It does not move from active to archived. Instead, it settles into patterns that change slowly over time, but never fully resolve. His absence remained anchored in personal memory, while the world around that memory continued to move forward. For his family, the aftermath was defined by a different kind of reality. Legal proceedings may provide answers about responsibility, but they do not restore the lived presence of a person. What remains is a permanent reorganization of life around absence. Everyday routines are reshaped by what is no longer possible. Conversations that would have continued are replaced by silence. Future plans are rewritten in ways that acknowledge a fixed point of loss that cannot be changed. The emotional impact of cases like this often extends beyond immediate family. Friends, classmates, and even acquaintances experience a secondary form of disruption. People who shared ordinary interactions with him before the incident are left with memories that feel unchanged on their surface, but altered in meaning. A brief conversation in a hallway, a group study session, a moment of shared frustration over coursework, all of these become emotionally reframed after the fact. Ordinary interactions take on weight simply because they cannot be repeated. Within the legal system, the sentencing phase brought closure in a procedural sense. The defendants received their respective sentences based on their level of involvement, with some facing life imprisonment without parole, and others receiving long-term sentences reflecting their roles in the crime. From a legal standpoint, the case had reached its conclusion. Responsibility had been assigned, judgments delivered, and the process of accountability formally completed. But the difference between legal closure and human closure is significant. The law operates within defined boundaries. It requires evidence, standards of proof, and structured outcomes. Human experience, however, does not resolve so cleanly. The questions that remain after such an event are not always questions the legal system is designed to answer. Why did this happen in this specific moment? How does a routine walk become a fatal encounter? How does a city that feels familiar also contain such unpredictable danger? These questions often persist long after the case itself has ended. In the broader context of urban life, the incident became part of a larger conversation about safety in public spaces near universities. Not as a singular anomaly, but as part of a pattern that cities continuously grapple with. The balance between accessibility and security is never fully stable. Increasing security measures can create a sense of protection, but they can also alter the openness that defines academic environments. Reducing measures can preserve freedom of movement, but may leave vulnerabilities that become visible only in moments of crisis. There is no perfect equilibrium in this system. Only adjustments made in response to experience. For those studying criminology, urban planning, or public policy, cases like this are often examined not only for their legal outcomes, but for the structural conditions that allow them to occur. The geography of the neighborhood, the timing of the incident, the presence or absence of surveillance, the behavior of groups in transitional urban zones, all of these elements become part of analytical frameworks used to understand how risk manifests in everyday environments. Yet for those outside academic or institutional analysis, the case remains something more personal and less abstract. It is remembered not as data, but as a story of interruption. A life that moved through ordinary routines, and was suddenly cut short in a moment that did not allow for preparation or reversal. Over time, physical spaces associated with the incident continue to function as they always have. Streets are walked, buildings are entered, nights pass into mornings. Urban environments have a capacity to absorb events without visibly changing. This continuity can be both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because it suggests resilience, unsettling because it can make past events feel distant even when their consequences remain deeply present for individuals. The sidewalk where Shinran Ji was last seen walking continues to be used by students every day. Most are unaware of its history in specific detail. Even those who know the case do not experience it continuously as they move through the space. This separation between knowledge and perception is part of how cities operate. Memory exists, but it does not always surface in the moment of movement. In the end, what remains of the case is not only the legal record or the investigative reconstruction, but the layered impact it leaves across different levels of experience. For the justice system, it is a concluded case with defined outcomes. For the university, it is a moment that shaped policies and awareness. For the community, it is a reminder of vulnerability within familiarity. And for those who knew Shinran Ji personally, it is an absence that continues to exist in the present tense of memory. The story does not continue in the way a living narrative does. Instead, it persists as a point in time that cannot move forward but continues to be referenced from the present. In that way, it remains fixed, while everything around it changes. And perhaps that is what gives it its lasting weight. Not only what happened, but the contrast between what was ordinary before it, and what could never be ordinary again, after it.I and the years after the Shinran Ji case faded from headlines and courtroom reporting, the story did not truly end. It settled instead into a quieter, more complicated phase of existence, one that lives in memory, institutional change, and the slow psychological imprint left on those who were indirectly touched by the violence. This final stage of the narrative is not defined by new events, but by the way earlier events continue to echo through time. At USC, the physical environment gradually returned to its normal rhythm. New students arrived each academic year, bringing with them the same mixture of ambition, curiosity, and uncertainty that defines university life. Classes filled, libraries stayed open late, and late-night walks across campus once again became part of everyday student behavior. On the surface, the campus looked unchanged. But beneath that surface, something subtle had shifted in the collective awareness of safety. Institutions rarely remain static after incidents like this. Even when time passes, they carry the residue of what occurred. Security protocols were reviewed and adjusted. Emergency communication systems were refined. Lighting in pedestrian areas received renewed attention. These changes did not erase what happened, but they represented an attempt to respond to it in practical terms. Universities must constantly balance two competing realities, preserving openness as a space of learning, while acknowledging that openness can also create vulnerability. For students who arrived after 2014, the case often existed only as a historical reference, something mentioned in orientation materials, or quietly discussed among peers, who had heard older students talk about it. For those who were present during that time, however, the memory remained more personal. They remembered not only the facts of the case, but the atmosphere it created, the sudden seriousness that spread across campus, the conversations about safety that felt more immediate than theoretical, the sense that a familiar environment had briefly revealed a different side of itself. This difference in perception created a layered memory within the university community. One layer belonged to institutional record, another to collective student memory, and another to individual emotional experience. These layers do not always align perfectly. Some remember the event vividly, others only faintly, and many who arrived later know it only as part of the university's broader history. Yet all of these perspectives coexist within the same space. Outside the university, the case became part of a larger conversation about urban life in Los Angeles. Cities like Los Angeles are complex ecosystems, where safety and risk are distributed unevenly across neighborhoods, and even across individual streets. The area surrounding USC has long been part of discussions about urban development, policing strategies, and community investment. The incident involving Shinran G intensified those discussions for a period of time, bringing attention to the experiences of students living in transitional zones between campus and city. Over time, however, public attention shifted to other events, as it often does in large metropolitan areas. News cycles moved on, and the case transitioned from active reporting to archival reference. But within the legal and institutional systems that handled it, the record remained fixed. Court documents, sentencing outcomes, and investigative reports preserved the sequence of events in detail. These records serve as a permanent account of what was established through evidence and judicial process. For the individuals directly involved in the case on the legal side, including investigators, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, the experience also left a lasting imprint. Cases involving violent loss of life, especially those involving young victims in familiar public spaces, tend to remain in professional memory long after they are formally concluded. They become reference points in future work, shaping how similar cases are approached and understood. But beyond institutions and professionals, the most enduring impact remains personal. For Shinran G's family, life continues in a world that permanently includes absence. Over time, grief does not disappear, but it changes form. The initial shock gives way to a more stable, ongoing condition of remembrance. Important dates become markers of reflection. Ordinary days carry quiet reminders of what was lost. The future is experienced through a lens that always acknowledges a fixed point of change. Friends and acquaintances also carry their own versions of this memory. For some, it appears only occasionally, triggered by specific places, conversations, or moments that resemble earlier experiences. For others, especially those who studied or lived near the location of the incident, the memory is more anchored to physical space. Walking through certain streets can evoke brief, unspoken recollections, even years later. Yet life continues alongside these memories, not replacing them, but existing with them. One of the most difficult aspects of understanding cases like this is the relationship between randomness and proximity. Shinran G was not engaged in extraordinary behavior that night. He was not entering a prohibited space, or taking unusual risks. He was walking home after an academic session, a routine action repeated by thousands of students every day. The violence that occurred was not the result of a long, personal trajectory between victim and perpetrators, but of a brief convergence of paths in a shared urban environment. This randomness is what often leaves the deepest impression on communities. It challenges the assumption that safety is always linked to personal choices in a direct way. Instead, it reveals how urban environments contain layers of unpredictability that cannot always be anticipated or controlled. This does not mean that prevention is impossible, but it does highlight the limits of individual awareness in complex public spaces. In the broader discourse on urban safety, such cases are often used to examine how cities can better protect vulnerable populations, without undermining the openness that defines public life. There is no single solution to this challenge. Increased security presence can deter certain types of crime, but it cannot eliminate all risk. Environmental design can improve visibility and reduce isolated areas, but it cannot fully account for human behavior. Education and awareness can help individuals make informed decisions, but they cannot guarantee outcomes. The tension between these factors remains unresolved, not because of lack of effort, but because of the inherent complexity of urban life. As time continues to pass, the memory of the Shinran G case exists in a state of quiet persistence. It is not constantly visible, but it is not entirely absent either. It appears in institutional memory, in personal recollection, and in the structural changes made in response to it. It also exists in the broader understanding that cities are places of both opportunity and vulnerability, where millions of ordinary movements occur each day, each one carrying its own small degree of unpredictability. Ultimately, what remains is not only the record of what happened, but the awareness it created, that routine and disruption can exist closer together than we often imagine. And that within the flow of everyday life, moments of irreversible change can occur without warning, leaving behind a story that continues to be told long after the events themselves have ended. Years after the court proceedings concluded and the sentences were handed down, the story of Shinran Ji continued to exist in a different form. It was no longer a breaking news event. It was no longer the subject of daily courtroom coverage or urgent investigative updates. Instead, it became one of those cases that settles into the background of a community's memory, resurfacing periodically whenever discussions arise about student safety, violent crime, or the fragile line that separates ordinary life from irreversible tragedy. For many people who first learned about the case through headlines, the details gradually faded. Names became harder to remember. Dates became less distinct. The intensity of public attention diminished. This pattern is common in modern society. New events replace old ones, and collective attention moves forward. Yet beneath that natural process lies another reality. The people directly connected to a tragedy do not move forward in the same way that public attention does. For Shinran Ji's family, there would never be a version of the future that did not include the absence created by that night in July 2014. When people imagine grief, they often focus on dramatic moments. They picture funerals, emotional speeches, or anniversaries marked by visible sorrow. But the reality of long-term loss is usually quieter. It appears in ordinary moments. It appears in empty seats during family gatherings. It appears when milestones arrive that should have been shared with someone who is no longer there. It appears in photographs that remain frozen while everyone around them continues to age. Before coming to the United States, Shinran Ji had likely represented something deeply meaningful to his family. Like many international students, he was not only pursuing personal goals. He also carried the hopes of parents, relatives, and loved ones who had invested emotionally and financially in his future. Studying abroad often represents years of preparation and sacrifice. Families imagine graduations, careers, achievements, and eventual reunions. They imagine stories that continue unfolding for decades. What happened in Los Angeles shattered that imagined future in a matter of minutes. One of the most painful aspects of sudden violence is not only what it takes away in the present, but everything it prevents from happening afterward. Every life contains countless possibilities that remain invisible because they have not happened yet. We rarely think about them while someone is alive. Only after a life ends prematurely do people begin measuring the scale of what has been lost. Shinran Ji was 24 years old. At 24, most people are still in the earliest stages of becoming who they will eventually be. Careers are just beginning. Relationships are still forming. Personal identities continue evolving. The future remains largely unwritten. When a person dies at that stage of life, the loss is not measured only by years lived. It is measured by decades that will never arrive. Within the USC community, the case left behind lessons that extended beyond security policies and crime statistics. It forced students to confront a difficult truth about adulthood and independence. Universities are often portrayed as protected environments, places where intellectual growth occurs within a relatively controlled setting. Yet the reality is more complicated. Students do not live entirely within campus boundaries. They move through cities. They navigate unfamiliar neighborhoods. They balance freedom with responsibility. For many international students, that challenge can be particularly complex. Moving to another country requires learning more than academic material. It requires understanding social norms, transportation systems, local risks, and cultural expectations that residents may take for granted. Every international student experiences moments of uncertainty while adapting to a new environment. Most navigate those challenges successfully. But cases like this reveal how vulnerable people can be during that process of adaptation. The tragedy also sparked conversations about randomness. Human beings naturally search for explanations after terrible events. We want causes that make sense. We want clear warnings that could have been recognized beforehand. We want to believe that disasters can be predicted and avoided if we are careful enough. But some crimes resist those comforting explanations. There was no long-running dispute between Shinran Ji and the individuals who attacked him. There was no escalating conflict. There was no personal vendetta. According to investigators and court findings, he became the target of a robbery because he happened to cross paths with a group seeking an opportunity for violence and theft. That randomness is deeply unsettling because it challenges the belief that life operates according to predictable rules. People prefer stories in which danger announces itself clearly. They prefer narratives where warning signs are obvious and outcomes can be changed through better decisions. Yet reality often refuses to cooperate with those expectations. Sometimes victims are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes ordinary routines intersect with extraordinary cruelty. This truth does not eliminate the importance of safety measures or personal awareness. Those things matter. But acknowledging randomness means accepting that risk can never be reduced entirely to individual choices. The perpetrators in this case were also young. That fact introduces another layer of reflection that remains uncomfortable to discuss. Society often divides people into clear categories of good and evil because such divisions feel emotionally satisfying. Real life is usually less simple. The individuals responsible for the attack were young people whose lives were already moving in destructive directions long before they encountered Shinran Ji. Nothing about that reality excuses what they did. The violence was severe. The consequences were permanent. Accountability was necessary. Yet understanding crime requires looking beyond individual actions and examining the broader conditions that allow violent behavior to develop. Communities, schools, families, economic pressures, peer influences, and personal choices all interact in complex ways. By the time a violent crime occurs, the factors contributing to it often stretch back years. This perspective does not reduce responsibility. Instead, it expands understanding. Every major criminal case leaves behind multiple questions. Some concern the victim. Others concern the offenders. Still others concern the society that produced the circumstances in which both existed. The most meaningful lessons often emerge not from simple answers, but from examining those overlapping questions honestly. As the years passed, the physical locations connected to the case continued their ordinary existence. Students still walked through University Park. Apartment buildings remained occupied. Streets remained open. Traffic lights continued cycling through red, yellow, and green exactly as they had before. Cities possess a remarkable ability to absorb tragedy without visibly changing. A person can walk through a location where a life was lost years earlier and never know what happened there. The sidewalk does not remember. The buildings do not tell stories. Physical spaces continue functioning according to their purpose. Memory survives through people. It survives through families who refuse to forget. It survives through friends who continue telling stories. It survives through institutions that document history. It survives through conversations that occur long after public attention has disappeared. In that sense, the story of Shinran Ji remains unfinished. Not unfinished in a legal sense. The investigation was completed. The arrests were made. The trials occurred. Sentences were imposed. But human stories rarely end when court cases do. Their influence continues moving outward through time, touching people who never met the victim and shaping decisions made years later. Every student who chooses to walk with friends after hearing about cases like this is part of that influence. Every university administrator who evaluates security policies is part of that influence. Every family that sends a child abroad while quietly worrying about their safety is part of that influence. The legacy of a tragedy is often found in those subtle changes. When people look back on the case of Shinran Ji, they see more than a criminal investigation. They see a young man pursuing education far from home. They see a future interrupted without warning. They see the consequences of violence carried out for no meaningful reason. And they see the enduring challenge faced by every community that seeks to balance openness, opportunity, and safety. Ultimately, the story endures because it reminds us of something both simple and profound. Behind every crime statistic is a human life that once contained plans, hopes, routines, friendships, and dreams. When that life is taken, the loss extends far beyond a single moment. It echoes through families, communities, and institutions for years afterward, leaving behind a silence that no verdict, sentence, or passage of time can completely erase. Morning light revealed the first visible signs of a tragedy that had already unfolded hours earlier.